He checked the security camera, expecting to catch his nanny breaking the rules. Instead, he saw 3 empty wheelchairs in the middle of the living room. His heart stopped. Then he saw them, his 3 paralyzed sons, standing on their own 2 feet, taking their first steps. His phone slipped from his hands as he collapsed to the floor, sobbing. This is a story of how one woman's faith shattered a father's broken heart and proved that doctors don't know everything. Welcome to Radiant Story and Tales. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you are watching from. Let me tell you about a man named David Cooper. He lived in a beautiful house in Portland, Oregon. Big windows, tall trees in the yard, rooms filled with expensive furniture. From the outside, it looked like a dream, but inside it was a tomb. 2 years ago, David had everything. A wife he loved more than breathing. 3 baby boys on the way. A future so bright it hurt to look at. Then, in one terrible night at the hospital, everything died. His wife, Rachel. Beautiful, kind Rachel. She gave birth to 3 sons, Daniel, James, and little Thomas. Triplets, 3 perfect boys. But 45 minutes after bringing them into this world, Rachel left it. No warning. No goodbye. Just a cold hand in his, and then nothing. David held her until the nurses made him leave. Then he walked down that hospital hallway to meet his sons. 3 tiny bodies in plastic boxes, fighting to breathe, fighting to live. And all he could think was, how do I do this without her? The answer came fast and cruel. 3 weeks after Rachel died, the doctors called David into a conference room. They had scans, charts, papers with words that felt like bullets. Cerebral palsy. Severe. All 3 boys. The damage was in their brains, in the parts that control movement. Their muscles would never work right. Their bodies would never obey them. Mr. Cooper, the doctor said, not meeting his eyes, you need to understand, these boys will likely never walk, never run, never play like other children. We're talking about wheelchairs, permanent care, a very different kind of life. David sat there, numb. He just buried his wife. Now they were burying his son's futures before they'd even had a chance to live. He asked the only question he could form. Is there anything we can do? The doctor shook his head. We'll do therapy, of course. Physical therapy, occupational therapy. But honestly, Mr. Cooper, the damage is too severe. The best thing you could do is accept it and prepare. Accept it. Such simple words for an impossible thing. So David tried. He hired nurses. He bought equipment. He turned his home into a medical facility. The nursery Rachel had painted with her own hands, yellow walls with elephants and giraffes, stayed empty. The boys lived in the therapy room instead, in special beds with rails and monitors. Months passed. The boys didn't improve. They sat in their wheelchairs, small and still, eyes distant. David hired the best therapist money could buy. He flew in specialists from across the country. Nothing changed. And slowly, David started to believe what the doctors said. His sons would never stand, never walk, never be the children Rachel had dreamed about. He stopped going into the therapy room, stopped holding them, because every time he looked at those boys, he saw everything he'd lost. Rachel, the future, hope itself. So he watched them through cameras instead. David installed security cameras in every room. He told himself it was for safety, for making sure the caregivers were doing their jobs. But the truth was darker. He was hiding, living his life through screens because real life hurt too much. And the caregivers, one after another, they all failed him. The first one quit after 2 weeks, said it was too depressing. The second one ignored the boys, spent all day on her phone. David fired her. The third one seemed perfect until he found out she'd been stealing medication from his house to sell. 11 caregivers in 18 months. 11 failures. 11 betrayals. One stole money. One accessed his bank accounts and disappeared. One sold photos of his boys to a gossip website for $600. Each betrayal carved out another piece of David's heart until there was nothing left but suspicion and control. He stopped seeing people as people. He saw them as threats, as liars waiting to hurt him again. So when number 12 walked through his door, a 28-year-old woman named Laura Bennett, David didn't even look at her like a human being. He looked at her like a problem that hadn't revealed itself yet. No improvising, he told her, reading from a list he'd typed up. No bonding. No hope speeches. Follow the medical plan. Exactly. The doctors have been clear about what these boys can and cannot do. Laura stood there in his hallway, quiet, hands folded. I understand, she said, but she didn't understand. Or maybe she understood something David had forgotten, because Laura didn't follow his rules. Not even close. She sang to those boys when she thought no one was watching. She talked to them like they could hear every word. She moved their little legs in patterns a therapist never taught, whispering, "You can do this. I know you can." And David watched it all through his cameras. At first, he watched to catch her breaking the rules, to find the proof he needed to fire her. But then something changed. He watched because he couldn't look away. Because in that therapy room, something impossible was happening. His sons were waking up. Daniel smiled during her songs. James's fingers moved when she played music. Little Thomas held his head up longer than he ever had before. David told himself it meant nothing. Coincidence. Reflexes. Anything but hope. Because hope, when you've buried it that deep, doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a trap. But late at night, alone in his office with those blue screens glowing in the dark, David watched a stranger fight for his sons with nothing but belief. And somewhere in his chest, in a place he thought had died with Rachel, something started to crack. He didn't trust it. He couldn't, because trusting again meant risking again. And David had nothing left to lose except the 3 small lives depending on him. So he kept watching, kept waiting for Laura to fail like all the others. He didn't know she was about to prove that miracles don't ask for permission. They just show up. David's morning routine never changed. Wake up at 6. Make coffee he wouldn't drink. Stand at the kitchen window watching the sun rise over a garden no one walked through anymore. Then retreat to his office and turn on the cameras. That's where he really lived now. In a room full of screens showing every corner of his house. He told himself he was being responsible, careful, protective. But the truth was simpler and sadder. He was afraid to be present in his own life. Laura arrived every morning at 7 exactly. David watched her come into the therapy room, greet the night nurse, check on the boys. And every morning, she did something that bothered him. She sat for 10 minutes. She just sat there between the 3 wheelchairs, not doing therapy, not following the schedule, just sitting, being present. David wanted to call her out for it. He was paying her to work, not meditate. But he noticed something. During those 10 minutes, Laura was learning his sons. She watched how Daniel's hands curled when he was uncomfortable, how James's breathing changed when he needed to be moved, how Thomas's eyes flickered when he was paying attention to something. She was studying them like they mattered. On her 4th morning, Laura brought a small speaker into the room. She set it on the shelf and pressed play. Soft piano music filled the space. David's finger hovered over the intercom button. This wasn't in the protocol. The boys had scheduled music therapy on Thursdays with a licensed therapist. Random music wasn't part of the plan. But then Daniel turned his head, just a few degrees toward the sound. But David saw it clearly on the screen. His son, who spent most days staring at the same spot on the wall, turned toward the music. Laura noticed too. She didn't make a fuss, just smiled softly and adjusted the volume slightly higher. James's fingers twitched against his armrest. David leaned closer to the monitor, heart beating faster than it should. Laura knelt beside James's wheelchair. She didn't touch him right away, just positioned herself where he could see her and waited. "You like that?" she asked quietly. "It's Chopin. My grandmother used to play it every Sunday morning." James didn't respond, but his fingers twitched again. Laura reached out and placed her hand near his, not touching, just close enough that he could feel her warmth. She stayed like that for a long moment. David's throat felt tight. When was the last time he'd sat with his sons like that? When was the last time he'd just been with them, without an agenda, without checking monitors or reviewing medical reports? He couldn't remember. That afternoon, David found himself walking toward the therapy room. He told himself he needed to check the equipment. But when he reached the door and heard Laura's voice inside, he stopped. She was reading a story, not a medical book. A children's story about a bear who wanted to climb mountains. Everyone told him bears don't climb that high. Laura read, her voice gentle. But the little bear didn't listen. Every single day, he tried. And every day, he got a little bit higher. David peered through the crack in the door. The boys were arranged in a half circle around her. She sat on the floor, the book open in her lap. Her eyes moved between the pages and their faces, connecting with each of them. Did he make it to the top? She asked. What do you think? Silence. But Thomas's eyes were open, fixed on her face, actually watching her. David stepped back from the door. His chest felt strange, tight and loose at the same time. He walked back to his office without going inside. That night, he reviewed the footage, watched her read that story 3 times, watched the way she changed her voice for different characters, watched the way she paused, letting the words sink in, watched his sons watch her. Something was shifting in that house. David could feel like a change in air pressure before a storm. He just didn't know if it would destroy him or save him. Week 3, Laura stopped following the protocol entirely. One evening, David pulled up the afternoon footage and nearly dropped his drink. Laura was on the floor with Daniel. She had his small legs in her hands and was moving them slowly, rhythmically. Left, right, like he was walking, like his muscles remembered something his brain had forgotten. David's jaw clenched. This wasn't in any therapy plan. No specialist had prescribed this. She was improvising, breaking every rule he'd set. He reached for his phone to fire her, end this before it went further. But then Daniel laughed. Not a big laugh, just a small sound, barely more than breath. But David heard it through the speakers, and his hand froze. His son was laughing. When was the last time he'd heard that sound? David set the phone down. His hands were shaking. He kept watching. Laura moved to James next. She positioned a small toy car just beyond his reach on the tray attached to his wheelchair. Too far to grab, without effort. Come on, sweetheart, she said softly. You can do it. Just a little stretch. James's arm stayed still. Laura waited, patient, unhurried. I know you can, she whispered. I believe in you. David watched, holding his breath without realizing it. James's fingers twitched. His arm moved slowly, painfully slowly, reaching forward, stretching toward the car. He touched it. Laura's face broke into the widest smile. Yes, look at you. Look at what you just did. James's fingers curled around the toy. David's eyes burned. He rewound the footage, watched it again. That small arm reaching, those tiny fingers closing around plastic. Such a simple movement. Something any other child would do without thinking. But his son had just done the impossible. David rubbed his face with both hands. This was dangerous. All of it. Laura was giving his sons false hope, pushing them beyond what doctors said was possible. When she failed, and she would fail, the disappointment would destroy them. Destroy him. He should fire her tomorrow. But instead of writing a termination letter, David pulled up more footage. Thomas, the smallest of the 3, the one who kept his eyes closed most of the day. Laura sat beside his wheelchair with a picture book, showing him the colors. This one's blue, she said, pointing, like the sky. And this one's yellow like sunshine. Thomas's eyes were open, fixed on the page. You see it, don't you? Laura whispered. You see everything. She turned the page. Thomas's hand lifted from his lap, just an inch, but it lifted. Laura noticed. She gently took his small hand and placed it on the book. There you go, sweet boy. You touch it. It's yours. David watched his son's fingers press against the paper. Something cracked in his chest, deep and painful. He closed the laptop, sat in the darkness of his office. And for the first time in 2 years, David Cooper didn't know what to believe. David didn't plan to confront her. It just happened. 3 weeks of watching through screens. 3 weeks of seeing his sons respond to a woman who broke every rule. 3 weeks of something building inside him. Pressure with nowhere to go. Tuesday afternoon, He left his office and walked toward the therapy room. Each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't knock, just pushed the door open. Laura was on the floor with Thomas. She had his small legs in her hands, moving them in that same pattern. Left, right, teaching his muscles something they'd never learned. She looked up, no surprise in her eyes, just calm acknowledgement. Mr. Cooper. David's voice came out harder than he intended. What are you doing? Laura didn't stop the movement. Motor pattern training. It helps build neural pathways. That's not in the protocol. No, sir, it's not. David stepped into the room. I gave you specific instructions. Follow the medical plan. No improvising. No experimental treatments. Laura gently lowered Thomas's legs and stood up. She faced him directly. The medical plan has them sitting in wheelchairs all day with minimal stimulation. That's not treatment. That's giving up. David's jaw tightened. The doctors gave you a prognosis based on statistics, Laura said, her voice even but fierce underneath. They looked at scans and charts and told you what usually happens. They didn't tell you what's possible. They're specialists. They've seen hundreds of cases like this. Have they seen your sons? The question hung in the air. David stared at her. Excuse me. Laura took a breath. Your boys aren't statistics, Mr. Cooper. They're not case studies or data points. They're children, and children deserve someone who sees them, not their diagnosis. You think you know better than doctors who studied this for decades? I think giving up on a child is the one thing guaranteed to fail. Silence. David's hands were shaking. From anger or something else. He couldn't tell. You're filling their heads with false hope, he said quietly. When this doesn't work, and it won't, they'll be devastated. Laura looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her eyes. Not pity. Something deeper. They're 2 years old, Mr. Cooper. They don't know what false hope is. They only know what they feel. And right now, they feel someone believing in them. She paused, maybe for the first time. The words landed like a slap. David opened his mouth, closed it. Laura turned back to Thomas, kneeling beside his wheelchair. You hire me to care for them, she said softly, not looking at David. That's what I'm doing. She resumed the leg movements. Gentle, patient, consistent. David stood there, watching her ignore him. His mind screamed to fire her right now, but his feet wouldn't move, because deep down, a voice whispered something he didn't want to hear. What if she's right? David turned and walked out. He didn't say another word, but he didn't fire her either. That night, David sat at his desk with a termination letter open on his laptop. The cursor blinked, patient and unforgiving. His fingers knew what to do. He'd written this letter 11 times before. Different names, same outcome. But tonight, his hands wouldn't cooperate. David minimized the document and pulled up the security footage instead. The house was quiet. Everyone should have been asleep. But the therapy room camera showed a soft glow coming from inside. Laura was still there. She sat on the floor in the center of the room, surrounded by 3 wheelchairs arranged in a half circle. A small lamp cast warm shadows. The boys should have been in their beds by now, but there they were, still with her. Laura wasn't doing exercises, wasn't following any protocol. She was just sitting with them, humming something old and gentle. David turned up the volume. She reached up and touched Daniel's hand where it rested on his armrest. Didn't grab it, just laid her fingers over his. You did so good today, she whispered. I'm so proud of you. Do you know that? Daniel's fingers curled slightly, small but intentional. David's throat tightened. Laura moved to James. She adjusted his blanket, even though it didn't need adjusting. Her hands moved with such gentleness, like he was made of something precious. Sweet boy, she murmured. You're so much stronger than anyone knows. I see it. Even if they don't, I see it. James's breathing changed. Slower, calmer. The way a child breathes when they feel safe. Then Laura turned to Thomas. She lifted his tiny hand and pressed it against her cheek. I see you, she whispered. All of you. Every piece. You're not broken, baby. You're just waiting. And I'll wait with you as long as it takes. A tear slipped down her cheek. David stared at the screen. This woman, this stranger, was sitting in his house at 11 at night, crying over his sons, talking to them like they understood, like they mattered, like their lives meant something beyond medical charts and therapy schedules. When was the last time he'd done that? He couldn't remember. David closed the laptop slowly. The termination letter sat unfinished. He should send it. Logic demanded it. Laura was dangerous. She was filling his sons with hope that would shatter them. But another voice spoke. Quieter, deeper. What if she sees something you stopped looking for? David stood up and walked to the window. The garden sat dark below, moonlight catching the edges of untrimmed hedges. He thought of Rachel. What would she say if she could see him now? See what he'd become? She would hate this. She would hate him. David pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He deleted the termination letter, told himself it was exhaustion. Finding another caregiver meant paperwork, interviews. He didn't have the energy. But as he climbed the stairs to his empty bedroom, he heard it, soft humming drifting from the therapy room below. Laura was still singing to his sons. And David realized a truth he'd been avoiding. He wasn't keeping her because firing her was inconvenient. He was keeping her because she was the only person in 2 years who hadn't given up on his boys. And somewhere deep inside, he needed to see what happened when someone refused to accept impossible, even if it destroyed him. Week 4. David stopped pretending he wasn't obsessed. Every night after the house went dark, he'd sit in his office pulling up hours of footage, fast-forwarding through empty hallways, pausing on moments that made his chest tight, rewinding scenes he needed to see again. Laura had transformed the therapy room. Small things at first. She'd moved the wheelchairs closer together so the boys could see each other, replaced the sterile white blankets with colorful ones she brought from home, added plants by the window, real ones that needed care. The boys need to see things grow, she told the nurse one day. David didn't stop her. He should have. It wasn't protocol. But watching the room transform from cold and clinical to warm and lived and did something to him he couldn't name. Then came Thursday afternoon. The licensed physical therapist arrived for the boys' weekly session. David watched through the camera as the woman, Dr. Patterson, examined each child. She'd been coming for 18 months. Started with Daniel, moved his arm, then his leg. Her hands paused. She did it again. David leaned toward the screen. Dr. Patterson looked up and called Laura over. They spoke quietly. David couldn't hear clearly, but he caught fragments. Significant improvement in muscle tone. This is unusual. What specific exercises have you been doing? Laura explained, gesturing with her hands. Dr. Patterson nodded slowly, writing on her clipboard. Then she examined James and Thomas with renewed attention. When she left an hour later, she paused at the door, looked back at the boys and at Laura. Keep doing whatever you're doing, she said. I'll adjust the official protocol to include your methods. David sat back in his chair. His heart was pounding. That night, he didn't just watch current footage. He went back, day by day, week by week. He watched Laura on the floor with James, moving his legs in walking patterns. Over and over, the same movement, the same rhythm. Patient, never frustrated, never giving up. He watched her hold Daniel's hands, helping him bear weight on his feet for just seconds at a time. His small legs trembling, then holding, then trembling again. But each day, holding a little longer. He watched her with Thomas, doing arm exercises to music. His tiny limbs moving slowly at first, then smoother, more controlled. David pulled up footage from her first week. The boys sat still in their wheelchairs, vacant, distant. Then yesterday's footage. Daniel reaching for a toy. James's foot tapping to music. Thomas holding his head steady, eyes tracking Laura as she moved. The difference was undeniable. David's hands trembled on the keyboard. He opened a new browser window and typed. Neuroplasticity in children with cerebral palsy. Articles flooded the screen. Medical journals. Case studies. Research papers from universities he recognized. He clicked the first one. Early intervention in pediatric cerebral palsy cases has shown remarkable results in neural pathway development. He clicked another. Repetitive motor pattern training can stimulate the brain to form new connections, bypassing damaged areas. And another. The infant and toddler brain demonstrates extraordinary plasticity. With consistent targeted intervention, children with CP have achieved mobility outcomes far exceeding initial prognosis. David read until his eyes burned, until the words blurred, until 3 a.m. crept past. Everything Laura had said, the neural pathways, the brain's ability to rewire itself, the importance of early intervention, it was all there, published in medical journals, proven by research, and he'd never looked, not once in 2 years. He'd taken those first doctors at their word, accepted their verdict like a death sentence. Stop researching. Stop questioning. Stop hoping. David closed the laptop and sat in darkness. His sons were improving, actually improving, doing things those specialists said they'd never do. And he'd almost fired the woman responsible. His stomach turned. For 2 years, he'd poured money into maintaining his son's limitations. Expensive wheelchairs, medical equipment, nurses who kept them comfortable in their diagnosis. But he'd never once fought for something more. Laura had been here 4 weeks, making $15 an hour, and she'd accomplished what his millions hadn't touched, because she believed, and he'd stopped believing the day Rachel died. David's eyes burned. His throat closed. Shame. That's what this feeling was. Deep, crushing shame. He'd failed his sons. Not by loving them too little, but by expecting too little. By accepting defeat before the fight even started. Rachel would never have accepted it. She would have researched every journal, consulted every specialist, tried every method. She would have fought with everything she had. But Rachel was gone, and David had buried his fight with her, until Laura walked through his door and showed him what he'd forgotten, that giving up was a choice, and he'd been choosing it every single day. David didn't sleep that night, or the next. He wandered his house like a ghost, passing rooms he'd stopped entering years ago. The formal dining room where he and Rachel had planned to host holiday dinners. The sunroom where she wanted to read while the boys played. The nursery with the yellow walls and animal murals she painted herself. He opened that door for the first time in 18 months. Dust covered everything. The 3 cribs still stood in their half-circle. A mobile of stars and moons hung motionless above them. Rachel's rocking chair sat in the corner, a folded blanket draped over its arm. David stood in the doorway, unable to step inside. This was supposed to be their life. He closed the door and walked away. Friday morning, he skipped his office entirely. Instead, he sat in the hallway outside the therapy room, back against the wall, listening. Laura was inside with the boys. That's it, Daniel. Just like that. See? Your legs know what to do. David closed his eyes. James, baby, look at you. You're holding that toy so tight. You're so strong. His throat ached. Thomas, sweet boy, you watching your brothers? You're learning, aren't you? David pressed his palms against his eyes. What had he done? For 2 years, he'd hidden behind screens and spreadsheets. He'd paid people to love his sons because he was too broken to do it himself. He'd accepted their limitations as permanent because accepting defeat was easier than fighting for hope. And all the while, his boys had been waiting for someone to see them. Laura saw them. A stranger saw what their own father had been too blind to notice. David heard laughter through the door. Small and breathy, but real. His heart cracked. He should be in there. He should be the one making them laugh. He should be the one moving their legs and holding their hands and telling them they could do impossible things. But he didn't know how anymore. Rachel had taken that part of him when she died. David stood up slowly. His legs felt weak. He walked back to his office, but he didn't turn on the monitors. Instead, he sat at his desk and stared at the photo he kept in his drawer. Rachel, 8 months pregnant, glowing. Her hands rested on her belly. She was looking at the camera with so much hope it hurt to see. I'm sorry, David whispered, for giving up, for hiding, for letting fear win. He put the photo back and opened his laptop. Not to watch footage this time. He searched for pediatric neurologists, specialists in early intervention, therapists who believed in neuroplasticity. He made a list, names, phone numbers, emails. If Laura could do this much in 4 weeks with nothing but faith, what could happen with real support, real resources, real belief? David stared at the list. For the first time in 2 years, he felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, but close. Something like possibility. He closed the laptop and stood up. It was almost afternoon, almost time for the boys' rest period. David took a breath. He wasn't ready to walk into that room yet. Wasn't ready to face what he'd become or what he'd failed to be. But maybe tomorrow he'd try. He didn't know that tomorrow would change everything, that in less than 24 hours, he'd witness something that would bring him to his knees, that his whole world was about to shatter and rebuild itself in a single moment. But for now, David sat in his quiet office, holding the smallest seed of belief. And somewhere down the hall, Laura was teaching his sons to walk. Thursday afternoon, David sat in his office, laptop open, tried to focus on work emails. Numbers blurred on the screen. His mind kept drifting to the therapy room. It was almost 3 o'clock. Laura would be finishing the boys' afternoon exercises. He'd watched the routine so many times he had it memorized. His phone buzzed. Motion alert. Living room. David frowned. The boys were supposed to be in the therapy room at this hour. He picked up his phone and opened the security app, expecting to see Laura moving them for a snack. The image took a moment to register. 3 wheelchairs sat against the wall. Empty. David's stomach dropped. His first thought was panic. Something happened. An emergency. Then he saw them. Center of the living room. Hardwood floor gleaming in the afternoon light. Daniel James Thomas. Standing. David's breath stopped. His 3 sons. His paralyzed sons. The boys doctors said would never stand. They were upright, wobbly, shaking, but standing on their own 2 feet. Laura knelt in front of them, about 5 feet away. Her arms stretched wide open. Tears streamed down her face. "Come on, babies," she whispered. "Come to me. You can do it. 1 step." David couldn't breathe. Daniel moved first. His small foot lifted from the ground, hovered, then landed again, an inch forward. A step. David's hand flew to his mouth. James went next. More cautious. His legs trembled violently, but he moved. 1 foot, then the other. 2 steps. A sound escaped David's throat. Something between a gasp and a sob. Thomas, the smallest, the one who kept his eyes closed. He stood there, shaking, arms out for balance. Laura reached toward him. "You can do it, sweet boy. I'm right here." Thomas's foot lifted. It came down. Another lift. Another step. 3 steps. David watched his youngest son walk toward Laura's outstretched arms. His phone slipped from his fingers. It clattered against the desk, but he didn't hear it. His knees buckled. David slid down from his chair, back scraping against the desk until he sat on the floor. His legs wouldn't hold him. On the phone screen, face down but still playing, he could hear Laura's voice. "Yes. Oh my God, yes. Look at you. Look at what you're doing." The boys reached her. She gathered all 3 into her arms, pulling them against her chest, sobbing openly. "I knew it," she cried. "I knew you could. I knew it." David sat on his office floor, unable to move. Tears poured down his face. His whole body shook. 2 years. 2 years of doctors saying never. 2 years of specialists confirming impossible. 2 years of accepting that his sons would spend their lives in wheelchairs. And there they were, standing, walking, reaching toward a woman who refused to believe what the world told her. David pressed both hands against his face and wept. Not quiet tears, not controlled grief. This was something deeper, something breaking open inside him that had been locked away since the day Rachel died. Every failure, every betrayal, every night spent watching screens instead of holding his sons. The shame, the fear, the hope he'd buried so deep he forgot existed. It all came flooding out in waves that shook his entire body. His sons could walk. His sons could walk. And he'd almost given up on them. David didn't know how long he sat on that floor. Minutes, maybe longer. When he finally found the strength to stand, his legs fell hollow. He grabbed the edge of the desk and pulled himself up. His phone lay face down, still showing the living room feed. David didn't pick it up. He didn't need to watch anymore. He walked out of his office on unsteady feet, down the long hallway, past the empty frames on the walls, past the silence he built around himself like armor. The living room door was open. He stopped in the doorway. Laura sat on the floor, all three boys in her lap. They were exhausted from the effort. Small bodies limp against her chest. She held them like they were made of something precious. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. She looked up when she sensed him there. Their eyes met. David expected to see triumph in her face. Pride. A look that said, "I told you so." But that's not what he saw. He saw compassion. For him. Laura didn't say anything. Just watched him with those steady eyes, holding his sons like she'd always held them, like they mattered. David's legs gave out again. He knelt in the doorway, unable to take another step. "How?" His voice cracked. "How did you know?" Laura looked down at the boys, then back at him. "I didn't know, Mr. Cooper." Her voice was soft, gentle. "I just believed." Something broke inside David. The last wall, the final barrier. He crawled forward on his knees until he reached them. His hands shook as he touched Daniel's face, then James's, then Thomas's, his sons. For 2 years, he'd watched them through screens, loved them from a distance, kept his heart locked away because losing more would kill him. But they were here, alive, fighting, growing, and he'd almost missed it. David gathered all three boys into his arms, pressed his face against their small heads, breathed in their scent. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." He said it over and over, an apology for every day he'd spent hiding, every night he'd chosen fear over faith, every moment he'd let grief steal from them. Laura quietly moved back, giving him space. But David reached out and grabbed her hand. "Stay," he said. "Please." She nodded. They sat there together on the living room floor. A broken father holding his sons. A faithful woman who'd refused to give up. For wheelchairs pushed against the wall. No longer needed. David looked at Laura through blurred vision. "You gave them their legs," he said. She shook her head slowly. "No, Mr. Cooper. They gave themselves their legs. I just reminded them they could try." David closed his eyes. Rachel would have loved this woman. Rachel would have loved this moment. And somewhere he believed she was watching. The afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The house felt different now. Not empty, not abandoned, alive. David held his sons tighter and let himself feel something he'd forgotten existed. Hope. Not fragile hope. Not cautious hope. Real hope. The kind that costs everything and gives back more. 3 months later, David stood in the doorway of the therapy room. But it wasn't really a therapy room anymore. Laura had transformed it completely. The medical beds were gone, replaced by regular toddler beds with colorful quilts. The walls were painted soft blue. Toys filled the shelves. A rug covered the cold floor where the boys played every day. And they did play. Daniel sat in the corner, stacking blocks. His hands still shook sometimes, but he could grip now. He could build. James was at the bookshelf. Pulling out a picture book, he wanted Laura to read. He walked slowly, carefully, but he walked on his own. Thomas sat in David's lap, pointing at pictures in a book about animals. His voice was small and unclear, but he was trying to say the words, trying to speak. "Bear," David said, pointing. "But," Thomas repeated, his face scrunched in concentration. "That's it, buddy. Bear, you're doing great." Thomas looked up at him and smiled. That smile still made David's heart crack open every single time. Laura walked in carrying a tray of apple slices. She'd stayed, of course. David had offered her triple her salary, but she'd refused. Said she wasn't doing this for money. She was doing it because she loved these boys. And she did. Anyone could see it. "Snack time," she called. All three boys looked up. Daniel dropped his blocks and started crawling toward her. James toddled over, arms out for balance. Thomas wiggled in David's lap, wanting down. David set him on his feet and watched his youngest son walk, still unsteady but determined, toward Laura and his brothers. Three boys who'd been given no chance. Three boys the world said would never stand. Walking, playing, living. David's eyes burned, but these were good tears now. The kind that come when something broken starts to heal. The doorbell rang. "I'll get it," David said. Standing up, he walked through his house. Past the walls were family photos now hung again. Pictures of the boys. Pictures of Rachel. Pictures of the life they'd built and the life he was building now. He opened the door. Dr. Patterson stood there with two colleagues, neurologists from the university. They'd heard about the boys' progress and wanted to study their case. Wanted to understand how three children with severe cerebral palsy had achieved what medical science said was impossible. "Mr. Cooper," Dr. Patterson said, shaking his hand, "thank you for agreeing to meet with us." "Come in," David said. He led them through the house toward the therapy room. Through the windows, he could see the garden. He'd had the fountain fixed last week. Water sparkled in the afternoon sun. The gardener had planted flowers. Rachel's favorite kind. Purple and yellow, bright against the green lawn. Life was returning to this house. Slowly, carefully, but returning. They reached the therapy room doorway. The doctor stopped, watching through the opening. The boys were sitting in a circle with Laura, singing a song about animals. They were clapping or trying to. Their movements weren't perfect. Probably never would be. But they were moving, participating, present. "Remarkable," one of the neurologists whispered. "How long have they been at this level of function?" another asked. David watched the sons. "They started walking 3 months ago. Every day, they get a little stronger, a little more coordinated. The progress is slow, but it's real." Dr. Patterson pulled out her tablet, making notes. The early intervention combined with the motor pattern training, the consistent repetition, the emotional engagement, it created the perfect conditions for neuroplasticity. The brain literally rewired itself. "It's rare," the first neurologist said, "but not impossible. We're seeing more and more cases like this when families refuse to accept initial prognosis and fight for alternative approaches." David nodded slowly. "I almost didn't fight. I almost accepted what I was told and stopped there." "What changed?" Dr. Patterson asked. David looked at Laura. She was tickling Thomas now, making him laugh. That beautiful sound he thought he'd never hear. "Someone believed when I couldn't," David said quietly. "Someone saw my sons as children with potential instead of patients with limitations." The doctor stayed for 2 hours. They examined the boys gently, respectfully, took measurements, asked questions, filmed the boys walking, playing, interacting. When they left, Dr. Patterson paused at the front door. "Mr. Cooper, we'd like to publish a case study about your sons. With your permission, of course. This could help other families. Give them hope." David thought about all the parents out there getting the same diagnosis he'd received, the same devastating news, the same crushing verdict. "Yes," he said, "use their story. If it helps even one family keep fighting, then yes." That evening, after the boys were in bed and Laura had gone home, David sat in the living room, not in his office, not behind screens. In the living room where his sons had taken their first steps. He held a glass of whiskey he wouldn't drink and stared at the spot on the floor where it had happened. 3 empty wheelchairs against the wall. 3 boys walking toward hope. David's phone buzzed. A text from his brother, the first family member he'd reconnected with after years of isolation. "How are the boys?" David smiled and typed back. "They're walking. They're talking. They're living." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Rachel will be so proud." David's throat tightened. He typed, "I know." He set the phone down and picked up the framed photo on the side table. Rachel, 8 months pregnant, glowing with joy. "I found my way back," he whispered to her. It took me too long, and I'm sorry for that. But I found my way back to them, to living, to hoping. The house was quiet around him, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet anymore. It was a peaceful quiet of a home where children sleep safely upstairs, where tomorrow would bring new challenges, new progress, new moments of joy. David stood up and walked a window. The garden fountain sparkled in the moonlight. Rachel's flowers swayed in the evening breeze. He thought about the man he'd been 2 years ago, broken, hiding, convinced that hope was too dangerous to hold. And he thought about the man he was becoming, present, fighting, learning that hope wasn't about guarantees. It was about believing that tomorrow could be different than today. His sons had taught him that, or rather, Laura had taught his sons, and his sons had taught him that impossible wasn't a fact. It was just a challenge waiting for someone brave enough to try. David finished his whiskey and set the glass down. Tomorrow he'd call the new specialist Laura had recommended, schedule another therapy session, research the next steps in his son's development. But tonight, he'd just be grateful for 3 boys who refused to stay broken, for a woman who refused to stop believing, for a second chance he didn't deserve but received anyway. David climbed the stairs and walked down the hallway. He paused at each bedroom door. Daniel, sleeping with his arm around a stuffed bear. James, curled up under his blue blanket. Thomas, the smallest, breathing softly in the darkness. David's sons, walking, talking, fighting, living. He pulled each door closed gently and whispered the same words into each room. I love you. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Then he walked to his own bedroom, lay down in the darkness, and for the first time in 2 years, David Cooper slept peacefully through the night. Because miracles don't need permission. They just need someone brave enough to believe they're possible. And sometimes, when you stop watching life through a screen and start living it with open hands and an open heart, you realize a miracle was there all along, waiting for you to see it. This story is a reminder that hope isn't foolish. Giving up when it's hard, when it hurts, when everything says it's impossible, that's when hope matters most. Because sometimes the greatest miracles happen not because conditions were perfect, but because someone refused to stop believing. Your story isn't over. Keep fighting. Keep hoping. Keep believing in the impossible.